Good evening, everyone. It is that time of the week again where I read to you some of the scary stories that people have shared. Hello, Comet Lug. Hello, Saxy. Hello, Circu. Hello, 14. Hello, Cheetah. Hello, Rat Goblin. How was everybody's day? Did you all eat yet? Has everybody eaten dinner? You started freaking out when your characters had a voice. Yes, good evening, good evening. I really enjoyed last week's scary stories, and that's why I decided this week we would be reading more. So, how was everybody's weekend? When was the last time that we talked? I can't really remember. Very forgetful. You bought a game. You're broke. It's fine. What did you buy, Saxy? What did you buy? You bought Valhalla. Oh, I see. Well, have fun. I've prepared quite a few stories again tonight from other souls. Souls that came before all of you. And as usual, they are quite long. Our first story for tonight is about a neighbor. How is your relationship with your neighbors? Are you on good terms with them? Or do you just simply pretend that they don't exist? A little odd. They're odd people. How so? What makes them so different? They look outside in their windows. Well, how do you know that they're looking outside if you're not looking at them yourself? You can feel the eyes on you when you go biking. That is fine. They don't go out either. So if they're watching you and you're watching them, which one of you two is the actual watcher? I wonder. Anyway, I think it's about time that we start. I've made sure to turn off the alert sounds, because last time I forgot about it and it kind of ruined the immersion for everybody else. So I am extremely sorry for that. I made a point to remember to turn it off this time. Anyway, the first story is called The Quiet Neighbor. Just about the first thing anyone new to the neighborhood learned was to avoid Bud Fillmore. Cantankerous, territorial, and fueled by what seemed to be a deep-seated hatred for just about anything. He was the kind of man that childhood nightmares were made of. Although he'd only lived there for a few months longer than us, by the time my family moved in across the street from the Fillmore house, his reputation was already firm established. When other neighbors came by with their cookies and casseroles to welcome us and saw me and my brother, just 9 and 11, they'd pull my parents aside and offer hushed warnings. "Keep them away from that nasty little man across the way," Mrs. Devon said. "He can't stand children." "My son Bill swears Bud tried to run him down with his car," Mr. Crane said. "He'll look for any excuse to yell at them. He says the most terrible things," Mrs. Paul said. My parents thanked them, but I don't think they quite believed them. My mom especially wasn't fond of gossip, and she tried to take such rumors with a grain of salt until she could make her own decisions. She didn't have to wait long. My older brother, Scotty, and I were outside tossing a ball back and forth one Saturday morning when Scotty tossed it too hard and high. It sailed over my head, bounced in the street, and rolled to a stop at the very edge of Mr. Fillmore's yard. Both of us had overheard our neighbor's warnings and were hesitant to even look at the house, much less approach it. "Go get it, Liz," Scotty said, nudging at my shoulder. "But you threw it," I replied. "So? You missed it." "Well, I couldn't reach it." My whining had no effect. He pushed me towards the road, and after checking both ways, I began to creep across towards our ball. I had almost reached it. I had to take a couple more steps, and it would have been within my grasp when the front door of the house flew open. "What the hell are you doing?" A stout man with thin, graying hair bursting outside and stomped across his lawn towards me. My ball," I tried to say, pointing to it. "You brats throwing things at my house? Think it would be funny to break a window?" No. I glanced over my shoulder to see Scotty half poised to run inside and whimpered, "Now get out of here," Mr. Fillmore snapped. "Can I just—" "No!" Before I could react, he'd scooped up the ball, which had barely been touching his grass, and stormed back inside. The whole front of his house seemed to shake with the force of his slammed door. It was the first of what would be many run-ins with everyone's least favorite neighbor. Our parents tried to talk to him about his behavior, but he just told them to keep their noisy little shits off his lawn and away from his house if we didn't want trouble. Dad thought about calling the cops on him, but as Mom became fond of saying, there was no law against being rude. So we were just told to try and be more careful. "He must not have always been such a bull," Mom said over dinner about half a month later after we'd moved in. "He's married, you know." My father scoffed at the idea. "Oh yeah? How do you know? Dolores Devon was by again for a chat and it came up. Bud wears a ring and she said she sees Mrs. Fillmore looking out the windows from time to time. But the poor woman never comes outside. She thinks she heard Bud say it was cancer once. Poor lady, sick and married to that, my father said. Terrible, isn't it? But it doesn't explain it about him. He's just trying to keep things quiet and peaceful around his house. Yeah, sure, Scotty muttered, and Mom frowned at him. He's probably very sad and lashes out without meaning to. He's an asshole, Scotty said. Language, my dad warned. But he is. Whatever his reasoning, we all agreed it would be best to just try and avoid Bud Fillmore. Scotty and I were extra careful to keep all of our toys well within the confines of our own yard when we played outside. I also couldn't help but keep a wary eye on the house across the street just in case he decides to be extra crazy and we had to run for it. That's when I started to notice Mrs. Fillmore. Almost every time Scotty and I were out and I happened to glance at their house, I would see a tall, slender figure outlined behind the sheer curtains in one of the upstairs windows. While I couldn't get a very good look at her, I figured it couldn't be anyone but the missus. Mr. Fillmore didn't have anyone else. She never banged on the window or shouted at us like her husband. She'd just stand there, watching us. I like to imagine that she was a nice lady, a quiet neighbor who just enjoyed seeing kids at play. I remembered my mom saying Mrs. Fillmore was sick and I felt sorry that she was trapped in her house with her horrible husband. So I tried to be nice and smile and wave once. Just once, Mr. Fillmore appeared on his front stoop and yelled at me for being a pest like I usually was until I retreated inside. When I peeked out the living room window later, Mrs. Fillmore wasn't in her usual spot anymore. Eventually, we got used to Mr. Fillmore glowering at us as he drove slowly past, his short temper and his loud voice. It was such a regular thing that our fear turned to caution, turned eye-rolling dismissiveness. Bud doesn't own the street. You kids go out and be kids as if he has a problem with it. I'll deal with it later, or I'll deal with him, my dad said. After that, we started to be a little less careful with our things and a little more free with our laughter. We lost a few balls to the Fillmore yard, 1 or 2 frisbees, but nothing we really cared too much about, nothing until Scotty's remote-controlled helicopter. It had been a birthday present and we were both eager to try it out. As soon as we finished supper, we raced out to the front lawn, where Scotty prepared the helicopter's first flight. Under my brother's inexperienced and clumsy guidance, the helicopter lifted slowly from the ground and staggered drunkenly through the air. In his excitement to keep it aloft, Scotty didn't even realize it was heading right for Mr. Fillmore's yard until it was too late. "Scotty!" I tugged at his arm to try and turn it off course. But it only made things worse. The little helicopter took a nosedive straight into the hedges of under Mr. Fillmore's bay window. Scotty frantically wiggled the controls, but the helicopter's blade was stuck fast in the thick greenery. As if he'd been waiting for us to slip up, the front door was flung open and he practically pounced on the toy. "What have I told you?" he bellowed. Before we could argue, he had already disappeared back into his house. Upstairs, the curtain fluttered just so, and I knew it was Mrs. Fillmore. I knew she was watching. I wanted to call up to her and ask her to get the helicopter back, but Scotty grabbed my wrist and dragged me behind him to find Mom and Dad.
When our parents went over later, he refused to come to the door. "Don't worry, kids," they assured us. "Next time we see him, we'll sit down and have a real discussion about this." That wasn't enough for Scotty, though. I followed him up to his room and sat on the end of his bed while he paced back and forth while ranting about how unfair it all was. He was fuming and was furious, and he wanted his birthday present back now. "But how?" I asked. He paused, his gaze sliding to his window and the house beyond. "We're going to take it." It was a childish, simple, stupid plan with no thought to consequence or punishment. We were going to break into the Fillmore house and get all of our things back. "We'll do it when he goes out next. I can figure out how to get the lock open. It can't be that hard. Then we just have to find our stuff." "What about Mrs. Fillmore? She never leaves." "You can distract her or something. I don't know. We'll figure it out." "I don't know, Scotty," I said uneasily. I didn't want to disturb a poor sick lady for a few toys. "Don't worry. We'll just be in and out. She probably won't even notice us when we're there." I doubted that, but I had a hard time saying no to my big brother. Scotty put his plan into action the very next afternoon. We were playing a game of horse in the driveway when Mr. Fillmore's garage opened and his car chugged to life. He was wearing his customary scowl as he drove by. The moment he turned the corner, Scotty chucked our baseball off to the side and bolted across the street. I checked to see if Mrs. Fillmore was in her window, and when I saw no sign of her, I followed. Scotty's idea of getting the lock open turned out to be using a small rock to break the window pane on the door above the latch. It was something he'd seen in a horror movie or something. Immediately, I had images of flashing red and blue lights and handcuffs, and my stomach turned sharply, but my brother whispered that it would be fine. "He can't prove it was us. Everyone on the street hates him." He sounded so confident that all I could do was nod. Scotty reached carefully through the broken glass, careful not to cut himself, and found the deadbolt. It clicked out of place and he pushed the door open, letting us into Mr. Fillmore's house. I clung to the back of Scotty's shirt as we tiptoed across the kitchen. It was spotless, obsessively so, and smelled of cleaning supplies. Every window had something tacked over it. Old blankets, towels, blocking out the bright afternoon sun and casting the room into a gloomy darkness that made the room seem small and oppressive. I swallowed hard and forced myself to follow Scotty. Every room was the same, fastidiously clean, organized, and shrouded in shadows. The bay window that I knew he spied on us from had a little hole cut into the heavy velveteen material, just big enough for someone to see out of. I could just picture him sitting on his plastic-covered couch, watching us, waiting for us to get too close. It was enough to make me shudder. We cleared the whole downstairs pretty quickly, but there was no sign of our things. "Shit," Scotty hissed. "He must keep it upstairs." "But Mrs. Fillmore, just stay close and quiet, okay?" I nodded, too nervous to say anything else anyway. We'd gotten up a few steps when the floorboards on the second floor creaked. Scotty immediately pressed himself against the wall and motioned for me to do the same. We listened to the soft padding of footsteps across from one room to another. "Scotty," I whispered, grabbing at his sleeve with both hands. "Let's just go." "No, he went too far this time. I'm going to get my helicopter." Door hinges squeaked from somewhere upstairs and the footsteps stopped. Scotty pulled his arm from me and scampered up the remaining steps. Reluctantly, I went up too. We found the guest bedroom first. It was all muted colors and magazines. It had quality furniture, void of any warmth or personality, like it was just set up for show, never intended for use. At least it was a bit brighter up here. The windows only had a few layers of sheer curtains over them, enough to obscure visibility, but still let in light. The second room was obviously Mr. Fillmore's. It was the most lived-in looking room of them all. And even then, that was only because there were some pictures hanging on the walls and some personal items on the nightstand. The bed was meticulously made. All the clothing, most of which was masculine, hung neatly in the closet. There wasn't even any hairs on the brush of the vanity. I wondered how someone could live in such a cold, lifeless house. There was one room left upstairs, the one Mrs. Philemon must have gone into. Its door stood half open. Scotty and I traced a look. His determined, mine silently pleading with him to go. He took a step towards the door. I shook my head and grabbed at the back of his shirt again. He brushed me off and placed to the flat of his hand onto the door, pushing it open slowly. Inside, the room was almost empty, except for a large vanity against one wall. A framed wedding picture was on it, and I recognized Mr. Phillimore, despite being younger and thinner. In front of the vanity, posed a tall stool, was a mannequin. She was wearing what I thought was a 50s housewife dress, white with little pink and green flowers all over it, a string of pearls, a blonde wig carefully combed into a bun. Her featureless face was fixed on the mirror in front of her. Scotty's brow wrinkled, showing the same confusions that I'd felt. We'd both heard Mrs. Phillimore walk into this room, but there was no one there. "Let's just go," I begged, a cold sweat starting to trickle down the back of my neck. Scotty shifted his weight, obviously torn, and the floorboard beneath his feet groaned. The mannequin's head turned sharply towards us. Scotty leapt back with a yelp, arm thrown out projectively in front of me. "Liz," his voice was trembling. "Run." I stumbled back down the hall on legs that didn't want to work. I could hear Scotty stomping along behind me, and behind him, a rapid skittering. We skid at the top of the stairs, and I grabbed the railing to keep from falling headlong down the steps. When I righted myself, I dared to glance back at the hallway. It was empty. Where did it... Something thudded at the ceiling. We both looked up and screamed. The mannequin was crawling, spider-like, over our heads. She rent her head completely around, turning her blank face towards us and lifted towards the wall. She started to descend, the whole time facing us. I was still screaming when Scotty hooked his arm around my waist and hauled me down the steps. We crashed at the landing, tripping over one another, and we could hear the click of fiberglass on wood as she pursued us. I was crying, scrambling on my hands and knees across the floor, and my brother was shouting for me to get up to go. He grabbed the back of my shirt and practically threw me down the hall. And then Scotty was shrieking. I spun. The mannequin was crouched on the last step, one arm outstretched. She had fingers wrapped around Scotty's ankle. They were tightening, until his bones started to crunch beneath her grip. He kicked her with his other leg, but it did nothing. She started to drag him back towards the stairs. "Scotty!" I screamed, but before I could move, he looked up at me and shook his head furiously. "Liz!" He could barely get the word out of the fear and pain that masked his face. "Run!" I wanted to stay. I wanted to grab his hand and pull with all my might and drag him out of that house with me, but he shouted again, "Run! Run!" over and over until the words became a garbled mess of howling, terrified cries that crashed me out of the same door we'd come in through. It was the last time I ever saw my big brother. No trace of Scotty was ever found. My parents searched. Police searched. There were dogs and special agents and tons of time, money, and energy were put into trying to find him. But none of it mattered. It was as if he had simply vanished. But Phillimore wasn't a suspect very long, with no evidence and no history of any kind of criminal record. He was let go. Scotty was dubbed as a missing child, reduced to a single box of paperwork that was all too soon moved to the old case stacks. No one believed me when I told them what really happened. They all said Scotty must have been kidnapped on our way back from Mrs. Phillimore's house, and I was too young to really understand it, that I had gotten confused and, in my fear, made up some story using the scary thing I'd just encountered. Mr. Phillimore's mannequin belonged to his late wife Sharon. He kept it after she passed because it reminded him of her. Sometimes he'd move it around, put it in a window, but it wasn't alive. You understand that, right, Liz? My therapist was fond of asking. I told her what she wanted to hear, even if it was a lie. The adults preferred it that way. It was easier for all of us. Maybe that was why I never showed anyone the note that had been left, taped to our door, typed and anonymous, that just said, "I tried to keep you away." I didn't think it would have changed anything. I knew though, and I never doubted myself or the fact that Scotty had sacrificed himself for me. And up until Mr. Phillimore packed up and moved a few years later, I would sit in my brother's room and I would stare out the window at his house. I would watch the second-story window, waiting for the telltale dark figure to appear behind the curtains, waiting for the quiet neighbor that everyone said didn't exist. The end.
Welcome. Wait, let me say hello to everybody. I missed quite a few notifications. I'm sorry. I didn't want to stop reading halfway. These nuts, thank you so much for the follow. Welcome back, Rohit. How have you been? Sandy, welcome back as well. Hello, Cheetah. Hello, Jack. How's everybody doing? Yes, we're reading stories tonight. Hello, Gibugs. How are you? How was everybody's day? Did you all eat yet? Hello, Inwa. Welcome back. You're sorry I haven't been to my streams lately. Oh, it's fine. I understand if you're busy. Hello, Mad Scientist. Hello, Sirku. Tobito, thank you so much for the follow. Thank you for being here. That was our first story for the night. You're eating? What's everybody eating? And for those of you who've already eaten, what did you have for dinner? Or lunch? Or breakfast? I'm just going to drink water. Thank you so much, Narves, for the hydrate and posture check. Hello, Lloyd. Good evening. You had baliwag for dinner. Oh, baliwag chicken is really good, actually. Hello, Fenris. Good evening. Yes, I'm reading you all to sleep tonight. So get on your beds, get under your blankets, and let me tuck you all in. To sleep, Saxy says. Yes. Let me sit on the edge of your beds while you all get comfortable. And let me read you all stories tonight. I need more water, hold on. I'm sorry for the mistakes that I've made while reading the first story. I haven't properly warmed up. Hello, Mackie. Did I eat yet? Yes, I've eaten. I ate 2 healthy things today. I ate a roasted vegetable frittata and I ate a vegan tuna sandwich. Hello, Prodigy. Thank you so much for the flower. Good evening. Greetings. How has everybody been? How was everybody's weekend? How was the start of your week yesterday? Vegan tuna sandwich from Starbucks. Oh, yes, the no tuna melt. That's exactly what I ate. Miss you. Thank you so much for the follow. Welcome. Welcome to all the new souls tonight. I hope you enjoy your stay. I hope you find comfort in our stories tonight. Hello, Lau. Thank you so much for the flower. How are you? You're pretty good. That's good to hear. I'm also doing exceptional tonight. You're all here with me, and that's what matters. Now, get in your beds. Get comfortable. You're doing good, Lau. That's good. Did you eat yet? You can't wait to hear another exciting story told by me and my soothing voice. Wow. The next story is pretty short. This one is entitled, I Think I'm Trapped in a Hallmark Movie. Have you all had your fair share of Hallmark movies? Do you have a Hallmark movie that stuck with you? Usually these are popular on certain events, I guess, like Christmas or Valentine's Day or Thanksgiving. But anyway, let's begin. I first noticed it in the kitchen. My sister was putting the final touches on a batch of Christmas cookies. Turning to get more icing, she bumped on the plate with her hip and it flew into the ground. Oh, gosh darn it. Huh? What? Gosh darn it. I chuckled. Who are you and what have you done with my sister? Brittany stared at me blankly. Look, I know my sister. She swears like a 50-year-old sailor, drunk on cheap beer. Ruining an hour's work of cookie making should have at least elicited a fuck. But it didn't. Ah, I see. This is an act for Jonathan. I winked at her. Don't worry, I won't tell. What are you talking about? She asked. I bent down, picking up the shattered cookies. You know, you're constantly swearing. Your secret's safe with me. I reached for another piece of cookie, picked it up, threw it towards the garbage instead of falling in. It ricocheted on the edge. Ah, fuck. I froze. At the exact moment I'd said fuck, a car horn had blared outside, drowning it out completely. I frowned. Fuck. And then another car horn. Fuck, fuck, fickety fuck.
Strangely, loud flocks of geese crawled outside of the window. What the... A dog barks. Is going on in here? I stared at Brittany, eyes wide. She ignored my question. We have to make more cookies, she continued, as if I hadn't said anything. If the Christmas celebration tonight doesn't impress Christopher, he's going to shut down the community center forever. The community center? When have you given a... I got censored again. About the community center. Since I started Woofies. What? You know, my business, baking dogs Christmas cookies. I frowned. These cookies are for dogs? She nodded. Okay, look. What has gotten into you? I stood up, brushing the crumbs off my hands. You don't even like dogs. You say they make too much noise and poop everywhere. You don't even like animals, period. Or kids. That reminds me, Christopher's nephew is going to be at the celebration. He's an orphan, and he loves dogs too. I think I'm going to surprise him with a puppy from the shelter. I stared at her. What? It's going to be awesome. Don't you love Christmas? I threw up my hands. You're acting really weird right now. I'm going to, go rest for a while, okay? She nodded. Eyes wide, a perky smile on her face. That's when I noticed something else. She wasn't wearing her usual outfit of a black tank top and skin-tight jeans. Instead, she was wearing a bright red sweater and a neat skirt. Her hair, which was usually tied up in a messy bun, fell in perfect, loose waves around her face. You're dressed weird, I muttered. She just smiled back at me. I trudged out of the kitchen, through the family room, and I was about to climb the stairs when I stopped. Something's different. Well, for one, my mom's house was clean, which was super weird because she's a borderline hoarder who keeps everything from 20-year-old Christmas cards to free pens. The clutter was gone. A fire was going in the fireplace, and a fluffy red throw sat across the sofa. Weird. But there was something else. My gaze caught on the mantle above the fireplace. Even from a distance, I could tell the photos were different. I've seen the photos there a million times. The dorky photos of me in braces that I hated, the photo of the four of us and our cat, they were burnt into my brain. None of those photos looked familiar. None of them remained. I stepped closer, studying the photos. A girl with braces playing outside, a mother and father sitting on a sofa, 2 toddlers beneath them, 2 girls holding hands while sitting on a swing. My heart dropped. Every muscle in my body paralyzed. They weren't us. They looked like stock photos. Stock photos of a family that very roughly resembled ours. I ran up the stairs, my head spinning, my throat dry. What's going on here? Nothing made sense. Not the way Brittany was acting, not the way she was dressed, not my mom's house, not her photos. It all clashed in my brain. It was all so wrong. I collapsed onto the bed of my childhood room, the only thing that felt familiar in this house. My stuff had been boxed up long ago, but the walls were still the same shade of lavender I'd picked out in middle school. The bedspread was still deep purple. The mattress was still soft as a feather. I lay in the silence. Funny how now there were no random car horns or flocks of Canadian geese. I was almost drifting off to sleep when I heard it. Footsteps in the hallway. Brittany? I called. but they sounded louder, heavier, like a man's footsteps. I shot up in bed, my heart pounding. Our father had passed away several years ago. Christmas dinner wasn't for a few days. Too early for our uncles to be here. I backed away, heart drumming in my chest. Hello? I called out. The footsteps paused. Who's there? I shouted. The footsteps resumed, closer. Now, so close that they were right outside my door. Brittany? I shouted, hoping she would hear me. Brittany, there's someone. The door opened. My voice died in my throat. A man stood there. A naked man, with only a small towel wrapped around his waist. He stared at me with dark, hungry eyes. Then he smiled. Honey? Are you okay? I screamed. Honey, what's wrong? The man was rushing towards me. I ducked underneath his outstretched arms and ran to the door. Down the stairs, out the front door. I heard Brittany shouting behind me, but I didn't listen. I kept running and running. In a few blocks, I reached town, but it wasn't our town. It was a cutesy little town that time forgot, with shops lining the sidewalk and tinsel strung up between the street lamps. Gone were the liquor stores, rowdy teenagers, and endless supply of litter. And yes, there was the community center. But not our community center of stained concrete and smashed beer bottles in the parking lot. No, it was now a darling brick building, a Christmas candle burning in each window. No, this can't be. What the fuck is happening? I hurried forward. As I walked, snowflakes began to fall from the gray sky. A few landed on my face and my arms. They didn't melt. Hey! I called out to the nearest person, a woman waiting across the street with perfect wavy hair and bright red peach coat. Hey, can you help me? She turned towards me, a smile plastered on her face. Of course! What do you need? I don't think I belong here. This isn't my town, I faltered. Her grin had faded. She now stared at me, face set in stone, eyes burning with hatred. Then she took a step towards me, and I ran. And that brings us here. I've been hiding out behind the perfectly decorated Christmas tree in someone's yard. Don't worry, the house isn't actually occupied. Despite all the cute lights and candy canes, I looked in the windows. The house is completely empty on the inside. So, I'm safe. For now. But I don't think it'll be long. There's a ring on my left ring finger, probably belonging to the man back at my parents' house. He'll probably call the police around here and tell them I'm missing, that I seem mentally unstable, that I should be apprehended immediately. At least the internet seems to work, but calling Brittany's number and my mom's has only resulted in static. All I can do now is ask for your help. If you turn on your TV and see a Christmas movie featuring a short girl with a mole on her right cheek and an AC/DC t-shirt, that's me. Help me, please. Help me leave this place before it's too late. And that's how our story ends. That story was entitled, I Think I'm Trapped in a Hallmark Movie. Hello, Mrek. Thank you so much for being here. And thank you so much for the compliment. Thank you for the love you redeemed, 14. I love you too. Thank you, Inwa. That was a very short story. It was quite short compared to the previous ones. Oh, thank you so much for the follow. Hello, Mage. How are you, Mage? Good morning. Hello, Ochin. Hello, Phoenix. Hello, Inari.
My voice is just it. Thank you. I'm glad you think so. Thank you. How is everybody tonight? How have all of you been? Did you all eat yet? Hmm. I'm currently restless. You can't sleep, so you're here. Oh, what time is it for you, Rick? Am I saying your name right? With the model, the laugh, and soothing tone, you're the perfect storytelling lullaby. Thank you. I am grateful that you think so. That is my goal here tonight, to tuck all of you in and read you all a bedtime story until you fall asleep. Hmm. Let me accompany all of you tonight. It's 5:55 a.m. Oh, you really can't sleep, huh? Have you been up since last night, or are you just about to end your day? You need sleep. I hope I can help. Anyway, how are all of you so far? Right now, I am scouring through the Reddit, the Reddit section, looking for more interesting stories to read all of you. Hello, Chris. Good evening. How was your day? What does that redeem points do? What do you mean? Oh, you want to be called a good boy? You're a good boy, Rick. You're a good boy. Good boy, Rick. You are recovering from yesterday's fatigue. Have you successfully regained your strength, Chris? Are you feeling better now? A bit. That's good. I hope you properly recuperate tonight. Oh, this one is pretty long. Yeah, this one is pretty long. Maybe we'll read this one. You dealt with 3 quizzes, went to bed immediately after the last quiz. I see. Yes, you do need rest, Chris. Rest your little head. You've been through 5 different streamers and you can't sleep. Listen, Rick, just put me on. Get comfortable under your blanket and close your eyes. That's all you have to do. Don't think about anything and just listen to my voice as I read you another bedtime story. Our next story tonight is entitled, My Uncle Once Poured Holy Water into a Cement Mixer. Today, I found out why. Had he lived beyond the Iron Curtain, my uncle would have spent most of his life in a mental asylum. In communist Czechoslovakia, however, mental asylums primarily served as a means of punishing political opposition, so my uncle was relatively free. Well, most of his life at least. Rural existence doesn't really lend itself to the nuances of mental health, so no one dwelled too far into his peculiarities. He was never formally diagnosed with anything, and I wouldn't dare to play doctor, but rest assured, he was far from stable. The village just considered him crazy and left it at that. Well, for most of his life at least. There was a horseshoe-shaped scar above his right eye. When I was a kid, I presumed he was strange because of that scar, but decades later, in hushed whispers after family reunions, I would find out that my uncle was born strange. As a child, he would walk out onto the hill at the edge of the forest and howl at the moon like a rabid animal. He shunned the regular toy trains and wooden soldiers that the other boys would play with and instead made his own dolls of sticks and straws. Once, he was old enough not to require constant supervision. My uncle would disappear into the forest for days on end and would only return back to the village of food and water. When, in his late teens, my uncle arrived at the breakfast table with blood dripping down his forehead, and his parents just assumed he had gone out for another misadventure. The boy was strange, but he was not deemed dangerous. As cryptic as his speech was, as incomprehensible as his behavior was, the village had agreed that he was harmless. The boy was strange, but he would never hurt a living soul. Until the autumn of '78, that notion held true. Much of my early childhood was spent following my uncle around the village. While his erratic behavior was a cause for concern for amongst the village, I found him fascinating. While the other adults in my life wanted to lecture me on cleanliness and how a young man should act, my uncle would tell me strange fairy tales about the magical creatures of the forest. The Vodniks, the Boginki, and the Baba Yaga. My uncle would fill my head with tales of fantastic beasts that roamed beyond the confines of the village. The talk of responsibility and cleanliness that all the adults in my life would subject me to was senseless noise compared to the mysterious sermons my uncle would impart on me. In '74 or '75, my great-grandfather died. A couple months after the village funeral, much of the family loaded themselves into their Trabants and Ladas and drove out to Poprad, the nearest city where the inheritance proceedings would take place. Even though my uncle had a downright antagonistic relationship with cars, when it came time to depart, he pushed me over to the middle seat and joined in on the ride. The man never shaved. For most of the drive, though, the hills unkempt his beard. It kept on rubbing against my face. I distinctly remember being irritated at the prospect of having to ride between him and my grandmother. My face itched and I was angry about not being consulted on the seating arrangements in the car. But by the time we arrived in the city, my spirits calmed. My family promised a solemn reading of the will. My uncle promised a stroll around the city. I chose my uncle, of course.
While my parents got ready for the reading of the will and arguments over who inherits what land, me and my uncle set off to walk through the center square. At least, that's what he announced to the family. Our course quickly changed. The main square Poprad was filled with all sorts of fantastic things that a village boy might find amusing, but my uncle had other plans. He led me out to the center towards a roadway. The cement houses that surrounded the road proved to be some of the interest, but after a while, they disappeared as well. All that was left was a busy road surrounded by fields. For what felt like an eternity, we dodged cars with nothing to shield us from the summer sun. I was starting to grow frustrated with my uncle again. I even started to complain about my legs hurting. But before my frustration manifested into a childish outburst, the true destination of my uncle's pilgrimage was revealed. The Poprad Airport. I was raised under a rock. I watched cartoons. I knew planes existed. I just never saw one in the flesh. Decades down the line, I would become an aerospace engineer. The moment clearly had an impact. That initial burst of pure fascination of seeing a real flying machine will stick with me till the day I die. But it will always be tainted by what my uncle said to me. My uncle grabbed me by the shoulder and pointed towards the airfield. With utter disgust and rage in his voice, he told me that the devil drives in one of those machines. You have to keep your eye on them. Over the years, I had chosen to forget about my uncle's inexplicable hatred of planes and just focused on the moment when I fell in love with engineering. Yet over the past couple of days, I have thought long and hard about what he had said that summer afternoon. I've also been thinking a lot about the holy water incident of autumn 78. The construction of the new fire station was the most interesting thing to happen in the village all year. The rickety church would still be the highest building in the village, but it would only retain its position because it stood on top of a hill. The two-story cement structure grew day by day and even half-finished managed to dwarf all the cottages around it. The autumn I spent every afternoon at my great-grandfather's grave. My parents thought I sat by the tombstone because of some sudden burst of filial piety, and they relaxed their stances on tours in response. Truthfully, I just sat there for a good view of the fledgling fire station. Watching the building be constructed in individual steps, from the metal scaffolding to the mixing of the cement, was utterly fascinating to a 12-year-old me. It was during one of my afternoon observation sessions that the holy water incident took place. I was watching the workers mix cement to fill up the metal skeleton of the second floor when the doors of the church burst open. Out came running my uncle with a jug of water cradled in his arms. After him, flustered, red in the face, came the village priest. Behind the sprinting priest, peeked out of the church doors like nervous sheep, came the attendants of the afternoon mass. The construction of the new fire station was the most interesting thing to happen in the village all year, but the holy water incident quickly overshadowed anything that had happened all decade. My uncle, dashed down the church hill towards the construction, gripping the stolen jug of holy water. A handful of workers were attending the cement mixer, but with savage shouts, my uncle dissolved their huddle. With the intensity of a firefighter and an ammunition depot, my uncle started to pour the holy water into the cement mixer. The priest was beside himself with zealous rage, but the man of cloth couldn't touch my uncle. One of the construction workers, however, unbound by oaths of non-violence, tried to intervene. He grabbed my uncle by the shoulders and tried to pull him away from the cement mixer so that the holy water would not be squandered. My uncle had never been a violent man. It was perhaps because of his harmless nature that the village tolerated his bizarre behavior. My uncle had never been a violent man. But when the construction worker attempted to stop him from pouring the holy water into the cement, he turned around and planted his fist square into the construction worker's nose. The impact of the punch could be heard from atop the church hill. The construction worker reeled back from the hit and landed straight on his ass at the gravel. As the man in dirty overalls collected the blood from his bleeding nose, my uncle finished off what he set off to do. He poured the rest of the water into the cement mixer, and then, when the holy jug was empty, he screamed a cry of victory. "Charcoal!" he yelled. "Charcoal for the long winter." Back then, those words meant nothing to me. My uncle continued to scream the charcoal thing until the workmen restrained him. He had punched one of the villagers. The issue should have ended there. My uncle would have chastised for his behavior, perhaps beaten a bit, but then he would be left to his own strange ways. My uncle, however, did not punch some unimportant hick. He punched an out-of-towner who came in to help with the construction. The out-of-towner also happened to be a good friend of the head of the fire safety committee. He was not going to let his broken nose go unpunished. The police arrived before sunset. By the time the sky was dark, my uncle was gone. They say he died of pneumonia in prison a couple years later, but no one really bothered to check. Once my uncle was driven out of the village, his existence fell completely into the realm of myth. People would occasionally mention him at a family reunion, but he was more of a punchline than a human being by then. The crazy uncle. The crazy uncle we don't talk about much. He had slipped my mind too. For a couple of weeks after the holy water incident, I was curious about his fate, about why he would put holy water into a cement mixer, about the charcoal for the long winter. Yet soon enough, those questions were buried beneath the universal blues of puberty. By the time I got out of high school, I scarcely remembered I even had a crazy uncle. I studied engineering in Prague. Then Bolshevik system collapsed halfway through my studies. I fought tooth and nail to move to the West. I finished off my master's in Delft and then, through a lucky set of coincidences, ended up flying across the ocean to Arlington. I spent most of my life in the US, away from my roots. I got married, had kids, got divorced, and worked myself to the bone in the process. When my father died, my schedule was far too hectic to make the flight back home. And all I managed to do was sit by his grave overlooking the now defunct fire station. My father was gone, and after a week or so of visiting, I found my mother on her way as well. I didn't show up for my flight back to the States. Instead, I stayed in the village where I was born. The first couple of weeks were confusing. The village was much smaller than it was in my memories of youth. Everything was quieter, more peaceful, and when night came, the darkness was so total, I felt like I could grip it in my fist. The once mighty fire station had become an empty building that served as a makeshift town hall and a place to have funeral receptions. The only thing that didn't seem to have aged was the rickety church that was, just because of it, got more unstable. It would collapse. After the disorienting arrival, I adjusted to my new rural life. My mother was confined in her bed, so I spent most of my time in the cottage tending to her or listening through the many books. I promised myself I would read after I retired. The days started to blur into each other, and I found myself much calmer, than I had been in decades. Rural life had turned out to be rather blissful. Then, a snake fell from the sky. Verona Halsin, the mother of the mayor, reported one day that a snake fell on top of her as she was making her way up the church hill. She was much older than my mother, but Verona's religious zeal and need to be the center of attention kept her animated well past her years. The mayor's mother claimed that the snake had been a punishment from God. The village veterinarian claimed that the snake was probably just some bird's dinner. The mayor claimed that the snake issue would be addressed. I did not busy myself with the snake affair. My mother's health had deteriorated to the point where I would wake up in the middle of the night in fear that she had died. I was more concerned with the impending funeral arrangements than a snake in the churchyard. It was during one of my paranoid middle-of-the-night wake-ups, however, that I found something to worry about. It must have been 2 a.m. I found myself sweating in bed and my mother's snoring had gone worryingly silent. I made my way over to her room to find her lying on her side, still alive, and quietly breathing. That's when I heard that terrible sound. It started off as a quiet rumble but quickly gained in dark tenor. Soon enough, the whole cottage was shaking. Somewhere above us, something terrible moved. It sounded like thunder amplified through a metal cave. The terrible noise was unlike anything I had ever heard before, as its mere presence made any thought impossible. It wasn't until the dark roar had fizzled into the distance that I realized that the noise sounded strangely familiar. I just couldn't place my finger on it. My mother has been hard of hearing for years now. She slept through the deafening roar, and when I asked her about it in the morning, she excused it as a simple thunderstorm somewhere off in the distance. Her explanation didn't calm me. In the evening, once my mother had gone to sleep, I found myself in need of company and a drink. Off in the village pub, the air was rife with discussion about more alleged snake sightings. More claimed the snakes were a sign of divine judgment. Others claimed that there was a stork nest in the steeple of the church. All were very convinced in their theories. The discussion was losing in its civility and threatened to burst into violence. Yet before fists and chairs started getting thrown around, Mayor Halsins begged on the table and demanded calm. The steeple of the church would be inspected on the following morning. The discussion of snakes was to cease till then. In that brief silence between the shouts, I thought of bringing up the strange howl I had heard in the night, but before I did, someone beat me to it. The city's kid spoke up. We had both moved to the village around the same time, but I had roots, he didn't. The kid asked about the strange noise in the night, and all he received from the table were stares. Halson told him it was just thunder. The rest of the table murmured in approval. The kid didn't take it. He said he saw a glimpse of the thing. Something had flown above the village. The kid started saying something about the thing shining with red light, but before he could get into any proper discussions, Halson stopped him in his tracks. It was thunder, Halson reminded him. The sound of the boy heard was thunder, and any further discussion was spreading panic, just like the snake talk. He was told, in no uncertain terms, that further input on the subject was not welcome. I had grown up around Halson and knew not to contradict him. The kid didn't seem to need the years of experience. He knew to stay quiet as well. After the mayor had shut him, up, the kid finished his drink and left. I was happy I didn't bring up the sound myself. Eventually, with a couple of drinks, I convinced myself Halcyon had been right. All I heard was some far-off thunder. At least that's what I told myself. I couldn't sleep that night. I had drunk enough to become sluggish, and my internal monologue had descended from words into vague notions. But consciousness refused to depart. I laid in bed, listening to my mother's strained snoring, trying to remember why the sound I had heard the night prior sounded so familiar. My mind was far too dull to even properly recall the sound. But by the time the bedside alarm clock creeped towards 2 a.m., it was no longer necessary. The sound was back, as if it had been tied to my mother's snores. It slowly crawled into reality. The roar above grew louder and louder until everything else ceased to exist. The windows of the cottage shook. My face grew numb. Everything in the world descended into nothingness to make room for that deafening sound. Perhaps because of exhaustion, perhaps because of fear, I couldn't bring myself to get out of bed. I laid under my covers with my eyes wide open, staring at the ceiling, trying to fully concentrate on that terrible sound outside. Well before the noise reached its deafening zenith, I placed it. It was unlike any engine I had ever witnessed. It was much louder and darker than anything I had encountered in the decades of my career. But the noise was unmistakable. A plane was flying at an extreme low altitude above me. I wanted to get up, to look at what sort of engine could produce such a horrid sound. Yet lying in that bed, I found myself paralyzed. The roar from the skies above, even muffled by the walls of my wooden childhood home, was so loud it made my teeth chatter. All notion of physical strength drained my body, and I was left motionless in bed. When the roar finally died down, when the night settled and all I could hear was the bubbling of the far-off stream and the snoring of my aged mother, I put my shoes and walked outside. Somewhere off in the distance, the terrible sound still rumbled. But aside from the burning moon, the sky was clear. Standing there, searching the night sky for a hint of a plane, my uncle's words crashed into my internal monologue. The devil drives in one of those machines. You have to keep your eye on them. There was a terrible storm the following day. Hail the size of fists dropped from the sky, and the gentle bubbling stream that led through the village threatened to turn into a flooding river. I had spent the whole day inside tending to my mother, but later I would find out that there had been a death at the church. A farmhand had been sent up to the steeple to check if a stork had made a nest there, but during his ascent, the wind had shifted and the ladder he was climbing turned loose. The farmhand met his end against the metal fence of the church. His death was not quick. On any other occasion, the death of the farmhand would have overshadowed all happenings in the village for weeks. The events of the following night, however, pushed the youth's death into obscurity. My mother had gone to sleep before midnight. I was alone in the cottage, sitting by the window and occasionally watching the clock sluggishly turn closer to 2 a.m. All that kept me company was her snoring, but beyond the glass I could see the other cottages were lit up just like mine. The storm had prevented me from talking to the other villagers about the roaring jet engine. But it was clear others were awaiting its return as well. We all sat around our windows, expecting answers. Instead of clarity, however, the village received destruction. I spent hours waiting by the window just so that I could see the source of that deafening sound. The closer the clock got to 2, the more my knees started to ache. Something deep inside of me demanded I turn away. Something deep inside of me knew that what was hiding behind that window was best unseen. By the time the rumbling started off beyond the hills, I had to grip the windowsill to stay upright. My teeth clenched and my eyeballs bulged, and I had to press my face against the glass, but I saw it. For a mere collection of seconds that will forever be scarred into my memory, I saw it. It was unlike any plane I had ever witnessed. Whatever make the Airbus was, it was bigger than anything I had ever worked with or seen. If you took the Antonov, painted it jet black, and then pushed its size to the very limit of aerodynamics, and then pushed it further, that's how big the plane above was. On its massive wings sat two blood-red lights with shot tendrils of my pain from my eyeballs to the back of my skull. Every moment I spent looking at the machine, I could feel my sanity slip away. I did not last at the window for long. Soon enough, I was curled up on the floor with my palms shielding my ears. Before my body gave out, however, I noticed the most horrid thing of all. The plane was flying dangerously low. The plane that was flying dangerously low and heading straight for the steeple of the church. Beyond the metal screech, I could not hear the impact. I could not hear anything. The universe distilled itself into a cacophony, and only a single thought, a single memory broke through. The devil drives in one of those machines. You have to keep your eye on them. Well, after the noise had rumbled off beyond the valley, I was still lying on the floor. My mind had been completely sandblasted by fear, and every inch of my body felt foreign. It was until I heard shouts from the outside that I managed to crawl to my knees. The church had indeed been hit. The steeple had been knocked down and reduced into nothing but kindling that burned over the graves. The rest of the church was also burning. It's as if the plane had sparked the fire itself. The sight of the eldritch Airbus had been enough to drive me to the floor, but the fire had brought me back to my senses. Without much conscious thought, I pulled on my shoes and ran to the old barn in search for buckets. Dozens of villagers helped. Quickly, we organized into a chain of young and old, and strong and weak, but our efforts did nothing to stem the blaze. It would take a solid hour for a fire truck to make its way through the winding hills of the valley. Well before the flashing lights appeared, there was nothing left of the church worth saving. When the bucket party had given up, chaos spread through the crowd. The city kid, the one that had first talked about the howl of the plane at the pub, he claimed he had taken a video of the crash. His phone, however, had shorted out and refused to turn back on. I had seen the plane. Others who had waited with their lights turned on had seen the plane as well. In the chaos, we did our best to support his claims, but our voices were quickly drowned out. Veronica Halson had seized the narrative and started to preach. There had been no plane, she swore. What she had witnessed was a strike from God. He had started with snakes dropped from the sky, then he brought down a mighty storm, and now, as zenith of his rage, he had struck down the steeple of the church. Her fervor quickly shifted from abstract accusations to godlessness of finger-pointing. She said it was the kid and the outsiders who had tainted the village. There were voices of reason in the crowd, but they were few. With the church still burning and the crowd wild with panic, Verona's words turned to absolute fury. The kid quickly fled. Fearing that Verona would search for a new scapegoat, I made my exit as well. When I returned home, I was shocked to learn that my mother had slept through the entire affair. Even as sirens of the overdue fire truck arrived by the church, her heavy snores scarcely changed in rhythm. I did not wake her up that night. I feared that the sudden shock might push her to the grave, and even if her heart could handle being pulled out of slumber, I couldn't imagine how I would explain what had happened to her. The roar from the sky was much louder than it had been the previous nights. With each passing sunset, the plane got closer and closer to the village. The Airbus cut through the church steeple as if it was a tower of toothpicks. I dreaded to think that would happen the following night. When my mother awoke, I brought her breakfast and tea to bed. I had no idea how to broach the subject of the low-flying airplane. At first, I tried to find a way to transition from our casual morning chat to the impending danger, but when no obvious path presented itself, I simply came out with it. I told my mother that an incomprehensible jet had crashed onto the steeple of the church. Tonight, I told her it would fly much lower to create untold suffering. It was time for us to leave the village. My mother took the confusing news with nothing but a twitch of the eyebrow. When I told her about the church, when I insisted that we get in the car and drive to the city, when I told her that we were in danger, she simply shook her head. Wordlessly, she pushed away her plate, climbed out of bed, and shuffled her way through the window. When she was still able to climb the church hill, my mother had been a religious person. She had never missed Sunday Mass, and whenever anyone in the family was making a change in career or undergoing surgery, she would provide nightly prayers to hedge bets with the Almighty. Seeing the burnt-down husk of the village church that morning, however, elicited no emotion from the woman. She simply gazed out of the window and then, in almost a whisper, she said, "Charcoal for the long winter." My mother wasn't looking at the church. She was looking at the old fire station. When I asked her to repeat herself, she acted as if she had said nothing at all. I asked about my uncle, about the charcoal, about the planes, yet all she did was shake her head and pity her poor brother's soul. Then, she quickly changed the topic of the conversation. She was going to cook lunch. I was to bring her some wood for the stove. I made a couple weak attempts at salvaging the mystery of my uncle, but my mother pretended she couldn't hear me. The thought of staying in the village despite the imminent danger was undeniably absurd, but I knew the old woman wouldn't get in my car willingly. When I went outside with the wood basket, it started to snow. As we ate lunch, she talked a little more than usual. My mother had always been chatty, but age had slowed her down. By the time I had arrived in the village, it was clear my mother had become unaccustomed to conversation. As we dug into the ghoulish thaw, my mother's sentences connected and she even seemed animated. She spoke of my childhood and my dad and my other family members no longer present. She even mentioned her brother. She asked me if I remembered how scuffy his beard was. I was happy to see my mother so animated, but I had to ask. As I brought up the airplane and the charcoal and the water slid into the cement mixer, her face softened. This time, she didn't pretend she didn't hear me. She shook her head and she smiled and told me everything would be okay. There was something in her voice that made me believe her. By the time we finished off lunch, the world beyond the window was white. My mother's post-lunch nap quickly turned into deep sleep, and I went out to chop some wood. With my head full of memories, I drifted into the sunset. Well before 2, I was still sitting vigil. Just after the sun set, a handful of cars made their exit from the village. Each pair of passing headlights nudged me towards the idea of escape, yet I knew it was already too late. The hill roads that led back to civilization were already dangerous to drive through during the day. Setting out after dark was suicide. So I waited, with my mother snoring into the other room and the moonlit world covered in snow. I waited for the plane to arrive. Beyond the window, other homes were lit up in anticipation. Knowing that I was not the only one awaiting the arrival of that incomprehensible machine made the minutes counting down to 2 almost tranquil. The first sign of that devilish rumble, however, wiped out all calmness from the world. My knees turned weak once more. All I wanted to do was curl up and avert my gaze from the incoming terror. With every ounce of courage I had, I gripped the windowsill and kept my eyes locked onto the trees beyond. The moment the dark mammoth rose from behind the trees, a flurry of pain shot through the back of my skull. I felt like someone was putting out cigarettes against the back of my eyes. The engine of the devil's machine was so overpowering that my agonized screams were nothing but a gentle tone in the nether regions of my ears. Each second that I spent looking out the window was tearing away at any conscious thought that was left in my brain. But I drove my fingers onto the wood of the windowsill and kept myself on my feet. I watched the black Airbus descend into the village where I had spent my youth. I watched the black Airbus head straight for the old fire station. The moment the plane's nose made direct contact with the cement structure and the brilliant light consumed the night, sparks were flying everywhere. The roar of the engine whimpered away and was replaced with the screech of 1,000 metal grinders. My eyes could handle the approach of the Airbus, but they could not withstand the impact. Drenched in tears, they gave out along with my knees. Lying on the floor of the cottage, the terror of the plane crash did not leave me. Every flicker of light that bounced in from the window seemed to be ripping the air through my lungs. In this state of utter panic, I grasped for breath and prayed that the world would return to normal. The cacophony lasted for what felt like an eternity. I was certain that my body would give out and that I would choke in the company of those horrid flashing lights, yet, eventually, with sudden silence, the noise stopped. My eyes were drenched in tears and every muscle in my body was shivering, but I managed to climb up to my knees and look out the window. The plane was gone. The plane was gone and the fire station still stood. Next to the cement building, blending into the moonlit night, sat a mountain of black. I scarcely registered the charcoal before my body gave up. I spent the whole night on the floor, drifting in and out of consciousness. Dreams never came, but when I did find myself in those brief moments of wakefulness, my body refused to get up. I lay on the floor the whole night, desperately assuring myself that I was still alive. The morning sun streaking in through the window was like a flickering candle compared to the sparks of the crash. Everything felt terribly distant and nonsensical. The universe in which an Airbus could dissipate against an old cement building felt far too incomprehensible to re-enter after my ordeal. It wasn't until I found my mother standing over me in the morning that feeling returned back to my limbs. She stared at the fire and the stove and was getting ready to cook lunch. With the same tone that she would dictate chores to me as a child, she ordered me to go outside and gather some charcoal. If I wouldn't go soon, it would all be gone. I lacked all eternity to argue or try to make sense of the world. I simply grabbed a wood basket and went out into the snow. By the time I made my way, the old fire station, the mountain of charcoal had turned into a hill. By the time we finished eating lunch, most of the stove fuel had been scavenged away. The whole affair still puzzles me, But after that one bright night, the Airbus never returned. I do not know what led my uncle to pour holy water into the cement so many years ago, but I understand the purpose of it now. My strange uncle saved us. He saved the village from an incomprehensible machine that threatened to wipe the village off the map. He saved us and made sure we were prepared for the long winter that was to come. The end. Thank you so much for the follow, Corpse Vomit, Lozen, and Fox 4000. You're scared, Rick? Why are you scared? Hello, Average Baka. Yes, it was a good, weird uncle. It was sad what happened to him, but such is life. Chills. Thank you, Inwa. You don't have to spam it, Rick. I'll only do it once every time. Hello, Barsama. You redeemed all your points. You know you can save your points to claim something else. But anyway, you're a good boy, Rick. You're a good boy. Good boy, Rick. How is everyone tonight? The stories tonight aren't all that scary, in my opinion. The stories last week were scarier, I guess. I'm also doing well. Thank you so much for asking. Just thirsty, I guess. Since that was quite a long read. It kind of depends on how I read them. Honestly, how I read these stories depend on what's happening as I read them. Because I've never read these stories prior to tonight. So, you know, it's just, I guess, instinct. Reader's instinct of how the story is gonna progress, I guess. This title looks interesting. Oh, it's a series. No, I don't want to read a series. I'm currently looking at the top stories tonight. I mean, the top voted stories. This one's also quite long, but I'm thinking we should make this one the last story for tonight, since I'm making a habit of only reading 3 every time. If you enjoy these and you would like to hear more stories, I'm planning on doing this every week around the same time, because I too enjoy reading these scary stories for all of you and reading you all to bed. So hopefully you can all join me again next week. This one is entitled Space Girl. Can you suggest stories for the next story? Of course. That would make everything easier. That is very welcome. Thank you for asking that, Inwa. Sleeping while listening and then seeing a nightmare. Don't worry, I'm here to protect you.
So let's start. Quite the whiplash. I'm sorry. I'll try to be more gentle when I talk after the stories. So this one is called Space Girl. We all called her Space Girl. Her real name was Megan Daniels, but nobody called her that. She'd been Space Girl since grade 2. She was the kind of kid who stuck out in the crowd with her long red hair, ghostly pale skin, and Coke bottle glasses. For as long as I'd known her, Space Girl had been quiet. She didn't like to be around us. She didn't play with us when we were kids. She didn't even talk much. Most of the time, she'd find somewhere to sit, far away from everyone else. Then she'd open up her little notebook and scribble inside it. Sometimes she wrote poems, sometimes she drew, but she would always be off on her own little world. Nowadays, I understand why we targeted her. She was different and she was alone. That doesn't justify any of it, of course. But kids can be cruel. I remember that it was Sasha Brown who told me that Space Girl was retarded because her mother was on drugs. She probably just made that up, but we all believed it. She had always been the worst towards Space Girl, and that she kept that up until the end. It all started in 5th grade when Sasha took her notebook. It had been raining that day, so we'd had an indoor recess. Space Girl sat in the corner at her desk, eyes focused on her notebook as she methodically worked on a drawing. Sasha and I had been sitting nearby at our desks, and we simply just watched her do her thing. "I can't believe they let that retard sit with us," Sasha murmured. "Look at her. Why do they even let them in schools? They aren't gonna learn anything." "Better than leaving her at home with her crackhead mom," said Tanya Everett. She and I weren't exactly friends, but she sat close to Sasha and I. "My dad always sees a different car in front of her house every day. He says that she lets boys come and they pay her so they can have sex." None of us could actually say the dreaded S word all the time. Sex was still a terrible unknown thing, and we had all been raised to believe that nobody decent would ever do it. Space Girl paused, and her eyes darted away from her book to look at us. I can only imagine she'd heard us. Sasha just stared right back at her. "What? Do we have a problem, Space Girl?" she asked. The teacher was out of earshot, and that gave her carte blanche to say whatever she wanted. Space Girl didn't respond. She just looked back down at her notebook, but Sasha had been challenged, or at least she thought she'd been. She looked over to the teacher's desk to make sure she was busy, then she got up and moved to Space Girl. "What are you even doing there, retard?" She reached out to snatch the book before Space Girl could stop her. "What even is this? A unicorn? What are you, 5? She handed the book to me, and I took it on instinct. There was a brightly colored drawing of a unicorn inside. The artwork was actually pretty nice, but I would never have said so. The book was passed on to Tanya next, and Space Girl could only look at us helplessly. "Wow, you can't even draw. Look at this." She tore the page out of the notebook, and Space Girl let out a startled whimper, as if she'd been struck. The picture was crumpled up and the book was thrown on the floor by Space Girl's desk. "Draw something that isn't trash next time," Tanya said. And Sasha just jiggled as if it was anything other than being mean-spirited just for the sake of it. Space Girl slowly picked her book up off the floor, avoiding eye contact as Tanya and Sasha turned away from her. I continued to stare. I remember that the way she moved was so defeated, as if she were shrinking in on herself.
She looked up at me, but only for a moment, and I felt bad for her. I really did. But I didn't do anything about it. I just left her to rejoin the others. After that, Space Girl became an easy target for Sasha and Tanya. Every chance they got, they'd harass her, and I'd regret to admit that I was usually right there with them. During the days where we could go outside for recess, Space Girl would always sit beneath the same tree, always working in her notebook. When she did, we would always lean on the trunk and look down over Space Girl's shoulder. "Wow, that's really good, Space Girl," was how most of her comments would start. "Do you mean to draw it like it got hit by a truck? Or is that just your style?" That was never a compliment. There was never a compliment. She would always find something to needle. "Can you draw me?" Sasha asked once. "I heard that retards were always like art geniuses or something. Maybe it'll even look like a person." Space Girl didn't look up at her. She seemed to be trying to acknowledge the insults. I won't pretend like I was blameless either. I never stopped them. And there were plenty of times where I was right there making fun of her because of what we did. And we weren't the only ones. More or less, everyone hurt her in some way or another. But she never complained. I think she was too scared to. It was December in the 7th grade, where things got even worse. I didn't know all the details, and I don't know just for how long things had been boiling over. But I'd heard a rumor that James Hardy had it out for a Space Girl. James had only been in my class a few times, and he wasn't in my class that year. He was a small, mousy-looking kid who was convinced he was the world's toughest gangster. The rumors said that someone had seen his dad going into Space Girl's house. Naturally, there had been speculation that they'd been having sex. Someone told me that James's parents had been divorced because of it. Somehow, all of these rumors had mutated into claims that James and Space Girl were dating, and I think that was what had rubbed him the wrong way. We were coming in from recess when some boys decided to pull a little prank on James. The whole prank had been set up by Brian Jordan and his brother Mike. They had some mistletoe for the holiday season and had set it up in the hall leading back to our classroom. Mike had grabbed Space Girl during recess, and we were holding her behind the door where the mistletoe was. When James walked through, they pushed her at him and snapped a picture. I'd been just behind James when it happened. I watched Space Girl come flying out seemingly nowhere, eyes wide and afraid, then slammed into James. They both hit the ground, and I could hear the other boys laughing. "Look, she gave you a kiss," one of the boys said. Space Girl was trying to crawl away from James to pick up her notebook, but somehow somebody had kicked it out of sight. I remember that she looked back towards James, and that there were tears in her eyes. She must have been terrified with everything that was going on. She clearly hadn't wanted any part in this, but there she was, at the center of it. "You fucking faggot assholes," James yelled as he picked himself up. "Hey, she just gave you a smooch," laughed Brian. "Come on, give her a kiss." Someone pushed Space Girl towards James, and he glanced at her as if it was all her fault. She tried to stand and run, but he was angry that he wasn't thinking straight. I watched as he grabbed her and hit her, a square punch to the jaw. Then he tossed her to the ground, and we went after Brian next. A teacher had to get in to pull James off of him. He, Space Girl, and the Jordan brothers ended up getting suspended right before the Christmas holidays. We didn't see Space Girl until January. We didn't see James or his friends ever again. On Christmas Eve, there was a car accident on the highway outside of my town. Supposedly, he had swerved off the road to avoid an animal of some kind and had gone into a ditch. Mike, Brian, and their parents didn't survive. On December 27th, James was killed while outside shoveling his driveway. My parents told me that he'd been attacked by an animal, probably a deer or something, but that seemed so unusual. I'd never heard anything about deer attacking people before, especially not in my area. I went over to Sasha's house the day before New Year's. We'd both gotten some gift cards for Christmas, and we were both planning to walk onto the mall together to use them. Her parents weren't home, they both had to work, so it was just us when I got there. "Hey, you kept me waiting," she said when I knocked on the door. "I'm sorry." "It's fine. I'll be ready in a bit. Come out upstairs. I want to show you something." I didn't question what it was. I figured it was just something she'd gotten on Christmas, so I went upstairs with her. "You're gonna love it," she promised me. "It's gonna be so funny." She led me to her bedroom, and as soon as she opened the door, I spotted a familiar notebook on her desk. "Where did you get this?" I asked, walking towards it. "Space Girl dropped it when Brian and his brother pulled that prank the other day. She dropped it. I may have grabbed it, just for safekeeping." She cracked a wry grin before opening the notebook. "Look at this. She's been drawing the same damn unicorn forever. She didn't even finish this one." She paused at one small picture that was labeled "The Unicorn Prince." It depicted an empty field with a blank space where the titular prince would have been. Sasha flipped through the pages a little more until she got to the newer ones. I figured since they kicked Space Girl out for a while and her mom is too poor to get her anything for the holidays, I'd step up. What'd you think? Sasha wasn't anywhere near as good of an artist as Space Girl was, but the simple detail in what she had drawn turned my stomach. In her first picture, Space Girl was hanging from a rope. Her tongue was hanging out, and her eyes were closed. In the second one, Space Girl had a gun in her mouth. In the third one, she was standing on the edge of a building. Sasha giggled as I flipped through her crude depictions of suicide. There were pages of them. "What do you think?" she asked with a grin. I bet she'll lose her shit." I closed the notebook and looked at Sasha. "Are you out of your mind?" I asked. Sasha's grin faded. "What do you mean?" "You stole her notebook. Just so you could draw these?" "Sasha, that's really messed up." It's Space Girl. Who the hell cares about Space Girl, Jane? You just drew her killing herself over and over again." I took the book off her desk. "Do you not understand what's wrong with that?" Sasha just stared at me like I was crazy. "Fine, sue me for trying to be funny," Sasha said. "Just give it here." She outstretched her hand to take the notebook, but I pulled back from her. "No, you're just going to put something else in here." Anger flared in Sasha's eyes. "Jane, give me the book." "No." I opened the book and I started to tear out those pages of Space Girl's suicide. Sasha lunged for me, trying to grab the book and stop me, but I pushed her back. I didn't mean to push so hard, but I did, and she fell, landing hard on the ground. For a moment, Sasha looked up at me, wide-eyed and shocked. I didn't think anyone had laid a hand on her before that. Then I saw something in her eyes, not just anger, something worse. It was the same thing that had prompted her to draw those horrible pictures of Space Girl. I turned and I ran, bolting down her stairs and out of her window, back into the snow. I clutched Space Girl's notebook to my chest the entire time, and I didn't let go until I got home. I spent the rest of the Christmas break terrified that my parents would get a call from Sasha's. I'd pushed her, and that seemed like such a big deal at the time. In hindsight, I doubt Sasha would have told her parents what had happened. They would have asked why I pushed her, and they would have told them about the notebook. On some level, she must have known that what she'd done was wrong. She was a cruel person, but there was a limit. Part of me hoped that she'd realize that I was right and would patch things up when school started again. But honestly, I wasn't so sure. I remembered looking through Space Girl's drawings, the ones she'd done. I remembered the ones I'd made fun of the most. There was one with a mermaid on a rock combing her hair. Her eyes were closed in relaxed bliss. I remembered saying how stupid her facial expression had looked, but honestly, I kinda liked it.
I flipped through the pages some more, through the unicorns, fairies, and castles, but I paused at the page depicting the unicorn prince. Back at Sasha's place, it had been blank, but at my house, it was finished. The unicorn prince stood proudly in his field, looking towards the sky with his horn proudly displayed. Maybe I had been thinking of a different picture. I brushed it off and flipped to the back where Sasha's pictures were. One by one, I started tearing them out of the notebook and tossing them in the trash. It was a waste of paper, but I refused to give it back to Space Girl with those images in it. On the first day back to school, I was up early. I made sure the notebook was packed into my bag and I was out as early as I could be. The snow on the ground was almost pristine as I walked to school, but I remember seeing some tracks on the lawn, headed down the side of my house, a deep U-shaped indents that looked like they'd been made by hooves. A deer, perhaps? I didn't dwell on them and made my way down the fleshy shoveled sidewalk and back to school. I wasn't entirely sure if Space Girl would be back yet, but she was. She was alone in the classroom, sitting at her desk and drawing in a brand new notebook. She paused briefly when I walked in to join her, and I could see her side-eyeing me. She didn't say a word as I drew nearer, but I thought I saw her shoulders tense up ever so slightly. Hey. I hope you had a nice holiday. She didn't respond. I'm sorry about what happened the other day. I didn't know anything about it, but it just seemed really mean-spirited. Still no answer. I reached into my backpack, taking out her old notebook. I put it on her desk in front of her. She stared at it, still silent, then back at me. Sasha took it. I was over at her house the other day and she showed it to me. I had to take some pages out, but she drew some really awful things in there. I didn't think it would be right to give it back with those things in there. I paused, feeling smaller as Space Girl stared at me. She didn't seem angry or thankful. She didn't seem anything at all, just stoic. I'm sorry if I wasn't all that great to you before, I said, and then I shuffled off my desk. Space Girl waited until I sat down before she opened her notebook and inspected it. Then she closed her new notebook and started something new on a fresh page in her old one. It wasn't much, but it made me feel at least a little good for what I'd done. When Sasha got in, she didn't talk to me. She didn't even look at me. Neither did Tanya or any of our other mutual friends. I knew from the moment they'd walk in that I'd burned my bridges with them, but I still wanted to try. The teacher hadn't come in yet, so I figured it might be worthy to try and talk to Sasha. I got up to move closer to her, and the look she gave me was of utter disgust. What do you want? She spat. Now it's my turn to be silent. Fuck off and leave us alone, Tanya said. You'd obviously rather hang out with some fucking retard than us, and I really don't want you spreading your retard germs to us. It's a quarantine issue. I stared at both of them, and I could have sworn I know how Space Girl felt. What was I supposed to say to any of that? Instead, I just returned to my desk without a word. Space Girl stared at me the entire time. Her pencil rested over her notebook, but she didn't write anything. She set it down, tore out the page that she'd been writing on, and jammed it onto her pocket. I later saw her toss it into the trash during lunch. I didn't really have anyone left, so I thought that maybe it might be a good idea to pull it out. Maybe it was something she was happy with? I'd never seen her throw a drawing out before. I was thinking that maybe she could use it as a peace offering of sorts, or something along those lines. When I saw what she had written on it, I almost threw it back into the trash. Your words. There is a land where your story may go. There is a land where your story may go.
A sickening land where it always snows. The snow is putrid in color and smell. Its substance, filth, and things I won't tell. Only your father has been there before. One day your boyfriend will visit once more. This place is your carcass, this humanoid hell. Your sorry can go there to this hole in your shell. My subtle message, this subtextual jazz, is take your apology and shove it up your ass. This was unlike anything I'd ever seen her write. It was so crass and spiteful. This was as close to hatred as she could have gotten. I understood why she'd throw it out. It didn't fit with everything else she'd done. Those things had been beautiful, despite what people had said to her. This was angry and ugly. It was something she'd written for me. I put it in my pocket. I wasn't going to give it back to her, but I wanted to keep it. I wanted to remember the way I made her feel. 8th grade wasn't fun for me. I had very few friends left, and Sasha never forgave me for turning on her. Her version of the story was slowly warped as time went on. First, I'd punched her and stolen the book. Then I tried to kiss her, punched her when she'd refused, then stole the book to try to get her in trouble. Rumors of me being a dyke spread pretty quickly, and hot on their heels came the rumors that I was dating Space Girl. I tried to not let them bother me too much. I knew the truth, and at the end of the day, I'd done the right thing. But by the time high school rolled around, I was hoping for a fresh start. There were new faces, and I figured I could make friends with them before Sasha's rumors spread. I had a bit of success in that department. I fell with a better crowd at least. Sasha stuck with the same old clique. I grew ever so slightly, but she was determined to live out the movie Mean Girls, and most people didn't pay her any mind. Space Girl barely changed at all. I didn't see her much when high school started. She was in a few of my classes, but I rarely saw her outside of them. Whenever she had a moment, she'd be in the library, usually in one of the corner cubicles, working on her drawings. Sometimes I thought about talking to her and trying to strike up a friendship, but it never felt right. Sasha's bullying never let up. Of course. She still stalked Space Girl to the library where she'd pull the same old shit she's been pulling since the 5th grade. She'd leer over her cubicle and comment on her drawings, picking them apart just like she always had. I stopped her whenever I saw it, but I didn't always see it. Coming to her rescue again, huh, Jane? She asked once when I'd interrupted her. Tanya leered at me from behind her, chewing gum with her mouth open. What's she ever done to you anyways? I asked. She's just minding her own business. Oh, what's she done to you, dyke? Sasha hissed. She leaned down over her cubicle and looked down at the notebook. Unicorns, 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 fucking unicorns. When are you ever going to grow up, Space Girl? Hey, I told you to stop. I rounded the cubicle and saw Sasha recoil. For a moment, I saw a bit of fear in her eyes. It vanished quickly and was replaced with a familiar rage. Fine, she said. Tan, let's leave the happy couple to their alone time. She pulled away from the cubicle and disappeared with Tanya nipping at her heels like a faithful terrier. Space Girl remained hunched over her notebook, her long red hair spilling over her shoulders. She seemed impossibly still. I turned to leave her when I heard, "Thanks." I looked back at her and saw that she was looking at me. You're welcome," I said. "Let me know if she bothers you again, alright?" "I will, but you're usually there anyways." Her soft voice was low. I'd heard it before, but I don't remember her ever speaking directly to me. "Yeah, well, it's just not right. She's such a child. One of these days, she's going to have to grow up." Space Girl just nodded, looking over towards the library door, then back down at her notebook again. For a moment, I thought about asking her what she was drawing. I thought about saying something else, but no. I didn't want to make her uncomfortable. I left her alone again. In 10th grade, I took art as an elective. I wasn't much of an artist, but I figured it would be an easy course. To the surprise of no one, Space Girl was there. I actually asked her to work with me on a few group projects. I think the prospect of being asked to work together was foreign to her. She looked at me suspiciously when I did it, but then she smiled. It was the biggest smile I'd ever seen. I went to her house for the first time to work on a portrait project with her once. We were supposed to take turns drawing portraits of each other, and I'd volunteered to let her draw me first. Rumors of her mother had always surrounded Space Girl, so I was entirely sure what to expect when I got there. I certainly wasn't expecting the quiet, neatly kept house that I found. The woman who answered the door looked like an older version of her daughter, sans the Coke bottle and glasses. "You must be Jane," she said. She wasn't smiling, but she didn't sound upset either. "Yes, ma'am. Come in. Megan's upstairs. She's just getting ready for you." The house was warm with plenty of knickknacks on the walls, plates and porcelain dolls mostly. Her mom sent me upstairs and I didn't waste any time. On the landing leading up to Space Girl's room, I could see a mural of family photos and paused to look at them. I could recognize Space Girl and her mom in most of them. Space Girl never seemed to be smiling. I only saw her father in a few of the very early photos. Space Girl looked like she was only a young child with a few pictures. In the few pictures I saw him in, though. I didn't dwell on long and headed towards what I assumed was her room. The cardboard stars and planes on it gave it away. Sure enough, she was inside waiting for me. She sat facing the door behind an easel in the center of her room. Her bed was neatly made and tucked away in the corner. She had a clean little desk that she'd clearly been working on and had set a chair out for me to sit on. I hadn't expected something so overwhelmingly formal, and I had almost started laughing. But then I noticed her walls. They weren't just covered in drawings. The art pieces of them were full-on paintings. They were the same fantasy depictions she always did, but the colors were so vivid. The clouds looked like fluffy pillows, and the castles seemed great and infinite. "Holy shit! Are these yours?" "They are," Space Girl said softly. She stood up and took the plate of cookies from me, then moved it to her desk. "It's soothing," she said after a while. "Painting, I mean. I pick the drawings I like the most and I finish them." She spoke softly, like she was careful choosing her words. Almost felt like there was something that she was trying to avoid. I spotted a painting on the floor that looked like a feather. The style was the same, but the content was different. He was surrounded by awkward scribbles, and he looked completely and utterly terrified. Space Girl looked down at it, but seemed to disapprove of it. She turned it around so I wouldn't have to look at it. "We should get started," she said. "Sorry." "No, it's all right," I said. I sat in the chair in front of her. "I'd like to hear about it." Space Girl watched me from the corner of her eye for a moment, as if she doubted I was being serious. But eventually, she sat down behind the easel and started to draw. Soon after that, she was talking too. I stayed long after she'd gotten what she needed for her sketch, just to talk. She told me that she'd always liked fantasy and how she liked unicorns because they were simple but pretty. I hung on to every word, and I could have sworn I saw her smiling shyly as she talked. The portrait she'd done of me was something else entirely. Her work had always been beautiful, but this made me look transcendent. I wasn't entirely sure what I was looking at was myself at first. There was something about the look on my face. There was a small, almost content smile there. The warmth it conveyed was almost Disney-esque. I love it, I told her. That's so incredible, Megan, it's really great. You can call me Space Girl if you want, she said. I don't mind the nickname. Not as much as I mind the people, at least. My awe quickly turned to shame, but Space Girl didn't look upset. She just stared at me blankly, while she often so did. No, not blankly. Her face might not have conveyed much emotion, but there was definitely some emotion there. I wish I'd been nicer to you when we were younger, I said. Is that why you're here now? She asked. No, I'm here for the assignment. I mean, the art assignment, the portraits. She continued to stare. Did you pick me because you felt bad for me? She asked. No, I just thought it would be cool to work with you. Space Girl didn't react for a moment, but then she just nodded. Okay. Her flat tone made it hard to know what she really meant by that. She stood up and walked over to the portrait. Mom can drive you home if you need a ride, she said. I opened my mouth to say something else. I wanted to apologize, but I didn't know what. I had offended her? Had I said something wrong? All right, thanks. It was the only thing I could think of. See you tomorrow. With that, I left her. I was almost afraid to see Space Girl the next morning. I drifted through my classes that day until I reached art, and when I did, I wasn't expecting what I saw. She had clearly been up late, but what she'd brought in stole my breath away. It was my portrait, but she'd done more with it than I thought possible. She'd painted over the sketch, turning me into something beautiful. Flowers bloomed around my brown hair, and a crown of daisies, lilies, chrysanthemums adorned my head. The colors were so vivid, and I looked so at peace with it. Space Girl was looking right at me as I came in, as if she was gauging my reaction, but all I could do was stare wide-eyed in awe. When I looked at Space Girl, she was smiling at me. Her project single-handedly netted us an A on the project and got the privilege of being hung up outside of the art and classroom. Of course, I told her how much I loved it, and I remember the way she smiled when I did. I remember thinking that it was the cutest smile I'd ever seen. My portrait was up for barely even a day before Sasha had to make a comment. I'd been on my lunch and had just gotten some fries from the cafeteria when she and Tanya ambushed me. Where's our flower crown, dyke? Sasha said. Leave me alone, I said, brushing past them, but Sasha was out for blood. I always knew you were a little dyke, but now you've posted solid proof of it. We've gone and cracked the case, haven't we? So what happened? Did you go to her house and lick her little retarded little snatch? You must have did a really good job because she went and drew that for you. I tried to walk away from her, but Sasha and Tanya just kept following me. What's wrong? Am I not pretty enough for you, dyke? She snapped at me. Maybe she only fucks retarded girls, Tanya said. I'll bet Space Girl squealed like a pig when she came. I stopped dead in my tracks, and I heard Sasha stop behind me. I didn't know what it was about what she said that pissed me off so much. But those two had finally struck a nerve. I spun around, swinging my lunch tray as hard as I could. Fries were scattered everywhere. But although I was aiming for Tanya, I hit Sasha. She went down hard, and I'm not sure if she was even still conscious when she hit the ground. Tanya was on me in an instant. She slammed me back against the wall and kept me pinned. She had size and strength on me, and there wasn't a thing I could do to stop her. Several other students grabbed us. A teacher finally got involved, and all three of us got escorted to see the principal. As we left the cafeteria, I saw a space girl in one of the halls, just staring at me. Naturally, I got a 3-day suspension, but Tanya and Sasha were fine. Both of them said they'd just been walking and I attacked unprovoked. It was their word against mine. Sasha had a familiar shit-eating grin on her as she left the office with only a bruise on her face, on her forehead, to show for her troubles, but there was a familiar look in her eyes, the same anger I'd seen last time I'd laid a hand on her, and something about it scared me. When I came back to school, I realized that I had every reason to be afraid. My portrait was missing. I wondered if they'd taken it down because I attacked Sasha, but the truth was a lot worse. "Someone took it," Space Girl said. She was sitting on her usual spot in the library when I found her. She was just sketching flowers in her notebook. "When?" "The day after you hit Sasha. I don't think anyone's found it yet." She didn't look up at me. She just stayed focused on her art. She didn't need to say it for me to know who she blamed. Who else would it be? I had half a mind to confront Sasha about it, but I didn't know if that would be a good idea or not. Sasha could easily just cry wolf. I wouldn't put it past her. In the end, it didn't matter. By the time I was headed to art class, the painting was back, but there had been some modifications to it. The words, "Retard fucking dyke," had been painted across my portrait in bright red. I saw it from down the hall and could see some other students whispering amongst themselves beneath it. I didn't know what to say or do, but this felt like too much. The picture was taken down quickly, but the damage was done. Sasha had gotten her revenge, and it didn't stop with just the painting. Space Girl looked different when I'd seen her in the library. She seemed uneasy, and her eyes were red like she'd been crying. "I'm sorry about the painting," I said softly. She looked at me before sighing. "I knew she'd do something like that," she said. "I'm so used to it by now that it doesn't bother me anymore. I'm sorry she wrote those things about you, though." "But you worked hard on that," I said. "I'd be upset too." She just shook her head. "That's not it," she said. She reached into her pocket, pulling up a crumpled piece of paper, then slid it over me. Slowly, I uncrumpled the paper and my eyes widened as I recognized what was on it. It wasn't the same drawing, but it was close enough. It was the depiction of Space Girl hanging herself, and beside me, a caption read, "Retard Dyke Wedding." "There were so many in my locker," Space Girl said. "This is what she drew in your notebook when I returned it to you. This is what I had to take out." Space Girl looked down at the picture again before averting her eyes. She didn't pay much attention during class. Instead of taking notes, she sketched in her notebook. I looked over her a few times to see her drawing another unicorn. This one seemed so similar to the one I'd seen before. She must not have been quite happy with it though. When I looked back at her notebook, the unicorn wasn't there anymore. She must have erased it, but it seemed so clean, like it hadn't been erased at all. Tanya was following me on my walk home that evening. I didn't know what she had in mind, but I didn't want to put up with it. When I was in the middle of a small walking path that cut behind some of the houses on my street, I stopped and looked at Tanya as she kept approaching. "What do you want?" I asked. "It's a surprise," she said. "Sasha and I just want you to know how much we love dykes in this town." Oops, I've said too much. I wanted to hit her. Dear God, I just wanted to hit her. But we both knew she could overpower me. Whatever Tanya had in mind, it wasn't anything good. She drew closer to me, unafraid of anything I do. "Come on, Dyke, go home," she said. "Let's go check out your surprise." In a sudden horrible moment, I realized that Tanya was threatening me. I also realized that I couldn't outrun her. I couldn't fight her off. I didn't really have much of a choice but to do as she asked. Slowly, I turned and walked towards my house with Tanya at my heels. It wasn't far, and up ahead I could see Sasha sitting on a park bench. From a distance, I'd recognized the red gas can beside her, and I stopped dead in my tracks. Tanya seized me by the arm and pulled me towards the bench. Sasha just watched with a wide, manic grin. "Hey Jane, how's it going? What the fuck is this?" "We just wanted to chat," Sasha said with a cold chuckle. "You think you can get away with pulling the shit you did the other day? No. You've been treating me like garbage for years, and for what? Because of Space Girl? You know who you're fucking choosing, right? Right? God, I hate that retard girl. But you know what? I hate you even more, acting like you're better than me just because you feel bad for her." "You're crazy," Sasha just laughed. "I'm not the one who choked someone with a fucking tray just for a little bit of teasing. You're absolutely fucking psycho." On the bench behind her, I saw the portrait that Space Girl had painted of me. Sasha picked it up and tossed it in front of me, then picked up the gas can and dumped it onto the canvas. "You wanna be a dyke? I don't care. But I'm not letting you and your retarded whore put your shit up. So say goodbye to your little project, slut." Sasha reached into her pocket and took out a book of matches. Her grid widened before suddenly vanishing outright as she took something behind us. "What the hell?" Tanya said as I cracked my neck to try and see what they were seeing. As for believing it, that was another story entirely. Standing on the path behind us was a unicorn, but the way it looked was all wrong. It was nothing like a regular horse. Its body was plain white and almost textureless, save for the many thin blue lines that ran along its body. It looked like it had been cut from a sheet of lined paper, but that was impossible. It had to be impossible. Neatly done gray lines defined the shape of the horse. In fact, the other lines reminded me of the ones Space Girl used. This unicorn looked like it had walked out of one of her notebooks. Tanya let me go and stumbled back a few steps, wide eyes as she stared at the advancing unicorn. It let out an angry noise before charging straight for Tanya. She panicked and tried to run. In her desperation to escape, she bolted down the path, but she couldn't outrun the paper unicorn. It lowered its head as it drew nearer to her, and in one swift movement, the horn pierced Tanya's back, impaling her straight through the chest. She screamed as she was hoisted off the ground, and the unicorn circled back to fix Sasha in a murderous glare. Tanya looked down at the massive spike stitching out of her, her eyes clearly wide with horror and her body twitching its last spasms as life quickly drained from her. The unicorn lowered its head to let her side off its horn as she hit the ground with a bundle of limbs. Sasha and I, in silent horror, stared as the unicorn roared up on its hind legs and brought its hooves down towards Tanya's body. She didn't scream. She didn't fight. She simply lay there as she was trampled again and again. I could only hope she died quickly. Sasha dropped the unit match and took a slow, terrified step back before toppling over. I stumbled back and looked down to see the portrait of me at her feet. But it had changed. That beautiful painted version of me was now leaning out of the canvas, invading the real world and clutching Sasha's leg tightly. Still, with that look of contentment on her face, I watched as the painted me slowly slipped back into her painting as she took Sasha's leg with her. Fuck! 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 Sasha desperately swatted the painting at me, but she couldn't overpower it. She couldn't escape. Her nails tried to dig into the pavement as she was slowly dragged into the canvas. She looked at me in horror, silently begging for help, but all I could do was stare back at her in silence. Jane! Jane, please! Please! Please help me, Jane! The hands of the painted me reached up, seizing Sasha by the hand and forcing her down into the canvas. It was like watching something pull her underwater. 1 minute she was there, the next she was gone. I stood silent in the park, staring at the painting, then at the paper unicorn. The unicorn huffed before retreating into the woods, and then I was alone. Slowly, I approached the painting and I looked down at it. It had changed and now depicted Sasha, her mouth open in a horrified final scream. And after some hesitation, I picked up the painting. I could return it to Space Girl in the morning. They chalked Tanya's death up to an animal attack. And nobody ever found Sasha. I never asked Space Girl about what I saw. I didn't even think she knew the answer. Although, she certainly knew much more than I did. High school was 10 years ago, though, and I've chosen not to remember as much as I can. I've got my own life to live now, and I try not to ask so many questions. Sometimes I see paintings move, but I don't bother with a second glance, and I never asked my wife about them. She doesn't like to talk about it, and I won't even force her to. The painting of Sasha hangs in her studio at home, right beside the painting of her father. Sometimes I look at it and I wonder if things could have been different, but I don't feel too guilty about it. I would feel too guilty if I had another story about a suspicious trampling or an animal attack either, but to my knowledge, there was nothing of the sort. I guess I shouldn't be too surprised. I do my best to make sure nobody hurts my beautiful space girl. The end. That took quite an interesting turn at the end. But altogether, it seemed like a nice story, considering that Jane and Space Girl ended up together. Thank you so much for the follow, Zen Traveler. Thank you, Slayer. Welcome, Itsuka. Hello, Key. Yes, it was satisfying, wasn't it? I'm not a big fan of violence, but sometimes people need their just desserts. Hello, Sammy. Welcome. How have you been? You were kind of expecting that ending, but you couldn't even see it in your mind vividly. It reminded you of Carrie. Midway, you fell asleep without taking a shower. It's all right. You joined in the middle of the story. Welcome. I'm glad you were able to catch the ending. I quite liked the story. It wasn't as scary as the other ones. Honestly, actually. The stories tonight weren't as scary as the ones next week, so last week. So hopefully next week we get a mix of both. I wish Jane still lit a cig and pulled the loose ends. It's sort of just odd stories. That's true. After all, I am reading this from the No Sleep subreddit. It's not really purely horror.
My voice today is different. How different, Saxy? We'll try to find and suggest some stories for the next story stream. Oh, thank you, Inwa. That would be very helpful. Deeper, mature, something like that. Maybe I'm just tired. Also, I'm quite thirsty. I don't know if you've all noticed, but yes, I've been taking water breaks. I don't know if any of you had noticed. Oh, and thank you for the hydrate and posture check, 14. Yes, I have to train my throat to read longer stories from now on. You noticed my model was leaning back to drink. Yes, sorry, I needed to hydrate. The stuff that makes you think way too deeply. Yes, I was stopping. I'm sorry. But I'm sorry to say that's our last story for the night. Yes. That is our last story for the night. Lionheart was here a while ago. I'm sorry I couldn't stop the story to talk to you, Lionheart, but if you're still here, thank you for dropping by. You can finally sleep good, yes. Last week's story reading was quite scary. I had to admit. Thank you so much for the flower, Itsuka. The stream is almost over, unfortunately. It's almost 11 and I don't think we have time to fit in another story. I have to wake up early tomorrow again. And I have to rest. Hello, not Rabukome. Yes. Hello, Sirku. A good night kiss before you all sleep. Of course, of course. You all get a good night kiss before we sleep. You have classes tomorrow? What do you mean, yay? It's like you guys are just here joining for the first time. You all get goodbye kisses from me when we're about to end stream. Although right now I'm trying to look for who I can send you to. Last time I wanted to keep the horror fresh and just leave you guys. Leave you guys suddenly. You love this channel already? Thank you. Can I just call you Rabu? It's not every day you get a goodnight kiss. Listen, every day that you're here, you get a goodnight kiss. Quite the devious move, yes. It seemed more appropriate. Call me anything, literally anything. Kome? Can I just call you Kome then? Yo, I just noticed your tone feels very horror compilation. Really? Honestly, I just tried horror stories last week and I quite enjoyed it. So I did it again this week. You believe you saw me on Morphe's stream? I don't think I've ever been on Morphe's stream apart from the shoutouts, but Morphe has been on my channel once. What about those overseas? Do we get a good morning kiss? Listen, everybody gets a kiss before I go, so don't worry about it. Anyway, oh, Ayumi. Ayumi's actually live. Ayumi is also known for doing ASMR. Maybe I could do you all a favor and... Oh, thank you for the Discord interest, Komi. Also, welcome, Mark. Mark 2. But yes, Ayumi rated us one time, and I want to return the favor by sending you all to her. She's doing ASMR again tonight, so let me start the raid. Yes, yes, she's also doing ASMR, so I'm sending you all to her. Thank you, Baku, thank you. Please join the raid by typing in !raid and waiting until I send you to Ayumi's channel. But anyway, thank you so much for being here tonight. Stay in your beds, get comfortable as I tuck you in. Good night, everybody. Sweet dreams. Rest in peace. Goodbye. I'll see you all again soon. Have a good evening, everyone, and a good morning to those of you who are on the opposite side of the world. Bye.
I'm gonna do that. Hold on, chat. I'm sorry. I know I'm not here. Yeah. I don't know if this looks good. I'm gonna remove it. I'm taking it out. I'm taking it out. Thank you for the follow. Thank you. Yeah, I'm gonna leave that alone. Alright. Oops. I have one eye. Thank you for the follow. What the fuck? My eye. Right there. Fixed. Thank you for the follow. I think that looks good. Oh my god, Jones, oh my god, I just noticed. Thank you